Duchess Ancaster sauntered off. Before Rain could decide whether to wander off in search of some sustenance, Sir Laurie said by her elbow, "Your mother has certainly aged well. It runs in the family. A pity it skipped a generation, or could your true pedigree be showing?" Rain could not be accused of not being fully armed. She raised a single eyebrow a fraction and sniffed in disdain. "Are you implying my father's pedigree isn't good enough, or that my mother is dishonorable enough to cuckold my father?" She ignored the fact that he had just called her old. The best way to deal with these kinds of insults was never to let them slide. Acknowledge and disarm was her father's policy on insults in general. "I would never imply that," he sneered. She didn't want to insult him or call him out, as that would only escalate the situation. He had once been the governor of Londinium, and now he held a prominent position at a bank that dealt with many of the people here. They would step up to protect him against the defective daughter of a duke. Not even good enough to marry, so in their eyes useless to society. Rain flashed him her teeth in a mockery of a smile and said, "Excuse me, sir, I see my brother." She sauntered off without even trying to pretend she was looking for her brother, and stopped when she was far enough that he wouldn't think of starting a conversation with her again. Lady Beechworth sidled up to Rain with a spare glass of punch. At least the woman offered a gift when she came to gossip. "Seen the dragon yet?" "He has a name," Rain corrected her, though she didn't actually know it herself. Lady Beechworth was dressed in a deep blue that suited her skin tone. She was about the same age as Rain's mother, though Lady Beechworth didn't use age to discriminate when it came to making friends. Instead, she gathered around her the most interesting people in society. She claimed they had the best stories. Yes, but with so few dragons in England, everyone is just calling him Dragon. One thing about Lady Beechworth, she always said what was on her mind. There was no chance of sly insults. If Lady Beechworth didn't approve of someone, she would announce it to their face. "I think that is all they care about. That he is a dragon." Rain could imagine that he had been reduced to his components by the ton. They could cut, even with their compliments. Lady Beechworth snorted as they watched the debutante simper close to the dragon, who spoke rapidly and emphatically with a harried lord. Dragons had never bothered to learn how to socialize with humans. Being the top of the food chain, Rain could understand the hierarchy of thought there. Dragons in general made people nervous even when they weren't reminded that dragons saw humans as an afternoon snack. Lady Beechworth turned philosophical and she pondered out loud, "I wonder if the girls realize that in attempting to be just like other women chosen by dragons, they have actually taken themselves out of the running. The whole point of collecting is to gather things of a unique nature." She waved her glass of punch towards the gaggle of girls all in gold gowns. No doubt they could all sing, play the pianoforte and paint a decent watercolor. At least having her destiny so drastically changed at a young age meant Rain had skipped many of those pursuits. She could sing, but only passably, and was pleased she didn't have to torture people with her mediocre renditions at insipid recitals. Though it had been her left hand that had been amputated, everyone had been sympathetic with any skill that required hands, and when she had expressed a dislike for the pianoforte and painting, she had been released from learning what was now a pointless skill in her current career. Lady Beechworth continued on with her own musings. "You would in fact be more of an interest to the dragon. Your career as the only female police investigator at the Scotland Yard and your hand place you in a class of your own. You should try to get his attention. He'd make you an admirable catch. He isn't looking for a bride." It was important to make sure Lady Beechworth didn't start playing matchmaker. Duchess Ancaster was formidable enough. If the two ever combined their efforts, Rain wouldn't stand a chance. "How do you know that?" Lady Beechworth's voice was suddenly sharp. "He hasn't looked at any of the women." The dragon was in an emphatic conversation with a gentleman whose eyes were slowly glazing over. The women jostled, urging each other to approach the dragon but unwilling to break protocol. "Hardly anyone here of an interest to him." Can't blame him for finding other entertainment. I'm sure if he met you, he would change his mind. Lady Beechworth was like a dog with a bone. She was unlikely to drop the subject unless Rain convinced her to. I'm not looking for a groom either. The sharpness in her voice wasn't to be mistaken, and Lady Beechworth tipped her head to the side to take in Rain. Eventually she came to a decision and tutted. A shame. He could do with the companionship. Especially after the scandal that surrounded his first wife's death. He has been away from society and people for 4 years. Dragons were essentially immortal, and any woman who married a dragon managed to benefit from that with an extended lifespan themselves. It was unusual for a dragon bride to die from disease or childbirth. How did she die? Grateful for the new direction of the conversation, Rain asked. Murder. More interesting and something which appealed to Rain. Lady Beechworth at least was decent enough to continue with the whole story when she saw Rain was mildly interested. They had only been married for less than a week. A whirlwind romance. As it always is with dragons, they are an impatient lot for beings that are immortal. It was said she had changed her mind and ran away from him. He went searching throughout the city only to find she had been murdered and left to rot in the Thames. He was distraught and blamed himself. He left Londinium after that. I don't think he has returned since. Not sure what brought him back. I think Eleanor was silly to run away from that handsome dragon. Eleanor? It was probably a coincidence she bore the same name that was engraved on the wedding ring. But what if what had brought the dragon to Londinium was the ring? Maybe he had killed the man with the ring. Except the dragon would have likely taken the ring if that was the case. There were flaws in her theory, but still intriguing enough for her to hand her empty punch glass to a passing footman. I think I'll go and talk to the dragon after all. Lady Beechworth chuckled, seeing this as a victory. Rain approached the dragon and she bowed her head a little in greeting. Lord Dragon, she said politely. It's Victor. He offered his name as his eyes flashed with gold interest. The Lord, the dragon had been torturing with his chatter, muttered an excuse and made his escape. Victor glanced after the man only briefly before he took her in. His eyes rested on her hand. He grabbed for it, but she had known the acquisition-minded dragon would attempt the move, so it was easy to evade him. Tut, dragon, it's rude to grab things. She wagged a finger of her normal hand as she would with a naughty child. He did not look embarrassed. Rain didn't think the breed could feel shame. He asked, excitement making him shift from foot to foot, is it made from brass? Do you have any sensation? Is it easy to maintain? I've heard of the progress in prosthetics, but I haven't come across one yet. Fascinating. My father had a tinker from the continent brought over to make it for me a few years ago. Before that I had something a lot less sophisticated. I'm interested to know, Dragon, why you have returned to Londinium. I heard you left years ago. Victor, he reminded her, and I thought it was time. This is my territory anyway. He shrugged. His eyes still on her hand rather than on her face. She had caught people staring before, but never this blatantly. Color touched her cheeks. Coughing to cover her reaction, she stayed on topic. Londinium is your territory. Well, I have a place out in Surrey. Londinium, like most cities, is considered neutral, though fighting amongst dragons is practically unheard of in the Empire. We are a family. I also have a place in town where I'm staying at the moment. Are you related to the Empress then? Most of the nobility were related to the Empress, but it was rumored that the dragons had closer links. He snorted at the concept. Unlikely. I never knew my parents. The Emperor always kept tabs on his relatives, and he would have claimed me by now if I was related. No, I mean we have made a family. Are you sure I can't examine your hand closer? She didn't correct him, it was an empress on the throne. He must find it hard to keep up with the ruling monarch when they never remained long on the throne and he was so long-lived. You may, but I have a few questions of my own. She offered her hand, which he took in his own, with reverence instead of revulsion. He twisted and turned her hand gently, aware that it was still attached to her. There were many that treated it like it was an accessory instead of the extension of herself it was. He pushed her sleeve up cautiously to reveal the edge of the mechanical hand. It was held on with leather straps that were then attached to a harness that went under her gown and across her torso. Unless someone cut the leather, there was no way they could detach her hand. Considering the small fortune her father had paid for the hand, it was of some comfort to know it couldn't be easily stolen. He bent her fingers individually and peered between the creases to have a peek at the inner workings. While he was distracted, she asked, "Did you ever give your bride a wedding ring?" Of course. Dragons always share their collection with their brides. A delicate little thing. She never liked anything too fancy, so it was an engraved gold band. Awkwardly, as he still had her hand in his as he continued to look at the workmanship the plated brass revealed, she took the ring out of her pocket. She always insisted on pockets on her gowns. Reticules were too annoying to bear. He let go of her hand to focus on her face. "Why are you asking?" Glad he had released her hand as she needed it to fold back the handkerchief to reveal the ring. Rain wasn't sure what reaction she had expected, but the bright blue light had her stumbling back. His dragon form filled the space with golden scales. He crouched low, so he didn't damage the ceiling. His large square head had short horns on the top and threatened to gouge the plaster on the ceiling. She could make out the individual gold scales of his body as she backed up. His chest had finer scales that were pearlescent rather than gold, while the rest of his body had scales the size of her palm. He roared, but Rain managed to keep her feet, though she did turn pale. His teeth were closer than was comfortable. And certainly larger than was comfortable. His claws slammed down on either side of her. Hardwood floors shattered and showered her with splinters. She flinched as pain sliced her cheek. Hot breath bathed her as Victor roared. Saliva dripped off teeth that were as long as her arm. His roaring stopped and he turned, his tail whipped people off their feet. Rain could now hear people screaming and running. They shouldn't have bothered as Victor was heading away. Besides, with the treaty in place, he wasn't about to turn the ball into a buffet. He disappeared and a flash of light outside revealed he had transported himself outside. She had never heard of dragons being able to do that. She knew they could manipulate matter and store things away, but she hadn't been aware that they could transport themselves over space. She ran to the window and saw him flying over the city. One thing was clear. The ring had belonged to his dead wife. Also, she was unlikely to be invited to Inverness's next ball. Everett said behind her, "That was spectacular. Highly entertaining, and you'll be the talk of society for a whole 10 minutes. Mother has gone for the carriage. If you want to get out of here without more talk, you need to move." Rain finally took in the carnage of the ballroom. It was almost deserted, with people huddled in fear on the opposite side. There was a flurry of activity from the servants and the host who tried to calm down their guests. As Rain passed the guests, there was a whisper of "Lady Goldenhand." She clenched her mechanical hand against the urge to hide her disfigurement. Once in the carriage, her mother said, "Well, that was spectacular." Everett grunted with agreement as he also joined them in the carriage. Duchess Ancaster seemed unaware she had echoed her son's sentiment on the whole fiasco, though Rain doubted her mother meant it that way. Rain buried her face in her hands and said, "I'll never be able to live that down." Everett snorted. "It only adds to your legend, Lady Goldenhand. Don't call me that." Rain snapped. "Why not? It suits you." Everett poked her prosthetic hand and she recoiled and glared at his juvenile teasing. "It only focuses on my mutilation, not on what I am capable of." The shocked silence in the carriage had her remembering their mother was there, and she didn't appreciate the self-deprecating humor she and her brother shared. "Sorry," he said, sufficiently contrite as he acknowledged that he had instigated the banter. "You are not mutilated." But there was a brokenness to their mother's voice. If Rain didn't know her mother had a core of steel, she would have thought her mother was truly affected. Instead, this was just her usual attempt to manipulate her strong-willed children into behaving. Rain slumped back in the squibs and decided silence was the better part of valor. When they got home, their mother hurried up to bed while Everett suggested, "Father's stash." They made their way through the orangery to their father's office. The large desk was looking a little neglected as their father mostly worked from the much more comfortable couch than his desk. There was one place clear of clutter, and with a little pressure to one of the carved roses and a click, it revealed a hidden compartment. Everett lifted the lid and passed her a piece of chocolate wrapped in waxed paper. She sat down on her father's couch and unwrapped the small candy. Everett also flopped down next to her. Rain asked as she eyed the chocolate and considered the best way to consume it. "Do you think I'm an embarrassment to the family?" she asked honestly. "Yes and no," he prevaricated. "That isn't comforting." She peeled back the wrapper. The chocolate was shaped into a small rose. "Others seem to be embarrassed by what you do, so in that way you are an embarrassment. The rest of us couldn't care less. It isn't like any of it is your fault. What about becoming a policewoman?" "That was my choice." There had been a whole slew of reproach from the society mothers when she had decided to have a career. Everett was quiet as he thought when he spoke. It wasn't what she had thought he was contemplating. "What made you do that? I mean, there are so many jobs you could have picked. Dad would have supported you no matter what you decided to do." Rain shrugged one shoulder. The whole conversation was making her uncomfortable as she had to take an intimate look at her own motivations. Especially as her brother would want more than the answers she gave to Larkin. "I needed to be useful. So many of society are mere ornaments. When I became broken and useless in their eyes, it made me realize how useless it is to be an ornament. So, I wanted to give back more than my looks or my pedigree." She sneered the last, implying that she had no looks to be proud of in the first place. Everett bumped her shoulder with his own. "You are appealing, and don't ask me to say that again. It was hard enough the first time. What about you, Everett? Are you going to be an embarrassment?" This was asked with a much lighter touch. Her crisis of purpose had already passed, and she was curious about the sadness she had seen in Everett's eyes earlier in the evening. There was a smile in his voice as he said, "I think I might. I have to think on it a little more. I don't know if I want to go back to school, but I do know that I don't want what Dad is doing." He waved to indicate their father's office. "This is so staid for me. I think I would die looking at all those numbers for the rest of my life." "It fits him though. Just find something that fits you and don't care what others think." That truth had been hard-won for herself, but had given her a sense of completeness she wished everyone could figure out. He licked the melted chocolate off his fingers, having already consumed his. "As long as I am not useless." "Yes. That is no fate for any of us. So, are you going to tell me what happened at school?" It was still a month till the end of the year. He was missing out on the exams, so this was no casual visit. She assumed he had been kicked out once again. There was a long pause, and she wondered if he would tell her. Since their conversation had been filled with hope rather than bitterness, she knew his future wasn't what troubled him. "There is this girl. She is smarter than all the other boys, and my professor wouldn't teach her. She must be pretty as well," as the wistful note in his voice was probably from a crush. "I thought I would show him. I went about it the wrong way." "In what way?" "Wasn't she grateful?" "Oh, she yelled at you, didn't she?" She struggled to keep her laughter inside and made a coughing sound instead. A sheepish look accompanied his reluctant answer, "Yes. She mockingly sympathized with him in a sing-song voice. "Oh, you poor baby. It was a stupid thing to do. I didn't help the girl and all I did was get a mark on my record and sent home early." He groaned dramatically. "They always threaten me with my record as if it will follow me everywhere. No one will see it once I leave school. The rumors will have a more lasting effect." Records. He was right about their penchant for writing everything down in their society. She wondered if there were any records about Eleanor's death. Chapter 4. Fields stopped her by calling across the foyer, "Miss Ancaster, have you had a chance to see to your weapon?" His voice raised enough to cross the distance but also making it possible for everyone else in the office to hear. Rain crossed to Fields in the hope he would lower his voice. "Yes, I did, sir. Thank you for providing the cleaning cloths." He sniffed. "It's a good weapon and should be treated with respect." "Did your father provide it?" "My mother, actually. She's the one who taught me to shoot." Her mother had grown up in the country and her father, who had no sons, had taken her along and taught her how to take care of the land, which included protecting it from brigands and thieves. "So you were trained by a woman. What kind of accuracy do you have?" His tone made it clear he thought her teacher was not qualified. "I can hit what I want to if I'm within 50 feet or so, but after that, I'd be lucky to hit anything." He wrinkled his nose, obviously not impressed with her honesty. She shrugged and said, "It is the flintlock, sir. I'd rather have a rifle any day." "Rifle? What kind of rifle?" "Some are much more superior than others." His tone changed to one of interest. Everyone knew the way to Fields was through the armory. "I haven't done much study, but my mother got me a Hawken when she got me the flintlock. I much prefer that, but I can hardly wander around Londinium with a Hawken on my arm." He grunted, begrudgingly agreeing. There were strict rules about which guns could be carried in the city. Most folk didn't have any access to weapons. The dragons didn't like them as they were one of the few weapons that could kill a dragon. Though that theory hadn't been tested as the invention of the gun had come after the signing of the treaty between dragons and humans. Rain shifted uncomfortably. There were several people watching avidly as it was unusual for Fields to engage her in a conversation. They expected Fields to dress her down. That was the only time he ever bothered to single her out. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said, "You'll have to bring it in one day for me to inspect. Maybe rifles should be kept on the premises just in case." He waved his hand in dismissal and Rain used it as permission to dash up the stairs to the archives and escape the speculative looks of the other investigators. The archives were a small room at the top of the building. A single table in the middle was set aside to peruse the documents as they weren't to leave the room. The walls were filled with shelves and books. On the table was the book that would direct her to the different records. Rain had barely opened the book that directed people around the archives when she was interrupted. "What are you doing in here?" Maines asked Rain. She looked up from the archived records and said, "I'm looking for the notes on an old case. I'm not sure if it is even here." Maines pushed her aside to replace her at the cabinet. "What case are you looking for?" His tone sharp. Rain wanted to tell him she could find it herself if this was an inconvenience, but Maines so far was the only superior willing to work with her besides her godfather. If he refused to deal with her like Fields did, then she would be unlikely to be given any cases. Or relegated to nuisance cases. She knew the only reason her and Larkin had been given this particular case was because no one had actually believed it was a real body. So, she bit her tongue and instead moderated her tone to a pleasant one and said, "The murder of a woman called Eleanor. She was the wife of the dragon, Victor." Maine's hands paused, but he went unerringly through the files. As he said, that was early days. Before even the police force. "We have records on it as the Bow Street runners had notes on the cases we inherited. I remember it. I was a young barrister back then. Worked as a personal assistant for a politician. Messy business. They never found anyone guilty. Though I think the dragon did it, personally. Vile creatures. He flicked through the folder and ran his finger down the reference list. He then went off further into the archives. He spoke as he worked. Anytime you involve dragons, things get messy. I don't know why they don't leave us humans alone. I know the Empress is related to a dragon, but that doesn't mean the rest of them have to stick their nose into government. He brought out a book and laid it on top of the table at the page noted in the catalogue. Make sure this doesn't leave the room. Maines huffed in exasperation. Rain could have found the file herself, but pretending to need his help would prevent a conflict. Maines would have been more upset if she had rejected his assistance. It confused her that people thought women were weaker when they insisted on doing everything for them in the first place. Rain merely shook her head and picked up the book. There wasn't much there, the names of the people involved and the address for the dragon, which was helpful. She would see if she could interview him and find out if he could shed some light on it all. The ring obviously was his dead wife's, and for the dead man to have it on him, he would have been involved in the original murder. The clues weren't many, but they did lead down a path she could follow. The interesting part was the name Sebastian. He was the man who was implicated for the murder but had been pardoned by the governor. There had to be something there for politics to be involved in the outcome. Considering Maine's attitude towards the dragon, there might have been some evidence that was uncovered later that pointed towards Victor. Larkin found her still in the archive. There's a lady here to meet you. The emphasis on lady meant it was not just a run-of-the-mill lady. A lady. Ladies rarely entered the confines of Scotland Yard, and when they did, it was to see people like Charles Rowan, her godfather and one of the leaders of the police force. They were never there to see her. Yeah, Lady Beechworth. Rain quickly returned the file to the cabinet and went to the small office she shared with Larkin. Lady Beechworth looked at the newspapers framed on the wall. They were her most famous cases. The wall was pretty much empty except for the 3 newspaper articles. Larkin's side of the office had more, as he had served longer than her. She had taken the tradition from him. After working together for 6 months, she bought him a stack of frames. It was from then that Larkin had accepted her as his partner instead of the annoying woman foisted onto him by his superiors.